Okay, so I'll start the recording now. This is our last session. It's pretty much an overview of the project management methodology that exists out there. And also after that, we can sort of look at a couple of examples of PowerPoint from last year's. And if you have any question, feel free to ask. So the methodology that we use for this particular course, it's called the waterfall approach. There are other types of project management methodology out there, and I'll give you sort of an overview of what those stuff are. Okay, just bear with me. My screen is frozen. Okay, so this particular session is about waterfall versus agile. So some of you know what agile means or have been involved with working with agile methodology for project management. We're looking into the overview of PMBOK, so the project management body of knowledge versus Prince2, and some other types of project management methodologies such as post-disaster and process-driven and change management as well. So, like I said before, what we use in this particular course is called the waterfall approach. You would have noticed from the life cycle of the project that it's quite sequential. So, according to that waterfall approach, you have to start one stage, initiating stage. Once you're finished, you move to the planning stage, the executing and monitoring stage, and then the closing phase. So you have one stage at a time, like a waterfall. So you're starting with one, you finish, and then you move to the next one and the next one until the end. So it shows that there is a sequence that has to be followed based on the life cycle of the project. But also it shows that one sequence or one task or one phase has to be completed before you move to the next one. And this sort of approach is more intuitive because people will have a little bit of expertise, knowledge, and perhaps do a bit of research for a particular project to do one phase and then finish and then move to the next one. And it's more suitable for projects such as projects in construction management. So another the other approach is agile. So how many of you have heard about agile? Anyone have heard agile? Yes. And how would you define agile, Umar?
Agile is it's driven from agility, so it's a kind of a quick solution. In a quick solution, in a way that a small problem is taken at one time, and that small problem gets resolved within that time frame to deliver the value within that time. And once that the people receive or stakeholders receive the feedback, and then it gets into the planning mode again, and the solution gets developed.
Exactly. So with Agile, it's more suitable for IT sort of project or business management project. And we use short cycles that we call sprints. And those sprints, you will have a phase where there is a vision and then the product roadmap and then planning, sprint planning, and so on. So it's actually suitable for project where the end result is not well defined. So you don't know exactly how the end will look like. You take your team, you divide it into small group, and within your team, those small groups will actually do exactly the same thing until one of the group will have a solution that will be tested. And if the solution is actually suitable for what the client or the customer want, then that solution will be released. So you have a group of small people, or let's say your team is divided in small groups, and within those sprints, they're working on the same thing. A bit of initiating of vision stage, planning stage, and executing stage until they find something, some sort of a result that can be tested, and so on. So with Agile, you have 7 steps. The step, the first one is the one where you have vision or the goal of the project, and that one is something that is discussed with the customer, even though you don't know the end result, but they still have some sort of vision or goal that they want you to achieve. And then your team will actually think of a product roadmap. So You will have that first stage where you talk to the client, the customer, perhaps to an interview or to a discussion, and your team and you would develop a product roadmap where you think about what what sort of process would you follow in terms of getting to the end or producing that product. And then you release a planning, so timing of specific product functions, and then you start the sprint planning. So stage one, two, and three usually are done as a whole group. But then when the team is divided into smaller sprints, that's when they will start sprint planning within each sprint or groups, or small groups. And they will do daily scrum as well. Daily scrum is actually a meeting that you will have before you start your work to brief your senior manager where you're standing, or perhaps your team leader where you're standing in terms of what every little stream or little sprint have done. And then you have a sprint review when the product is released so that everyone tests whether or not this product is working. And if it's working, that will be released as the final product. So in terms of roadmap, it will look a little bit like this, where you have the initial planning and the product backlog. So with that, you will have the first initial meeting with your clients, your sponsor, your senior manager, or your customer. And then you will define through perhaps an interview what sort of products they have in mind without actually knowing exactly how it will look like at the end. And you divide your team in smaller sprints or group. And within those smaller sprints, they will follow pretty much the normal stages of a project: planning, executing, and releasing a product. And once the product is released, they have to be tested, and the one that is actually suitable will be used for the entire team. And you will also have tasks like daily scrum, where you have daily briefing with your senior team manager or perhaps your project manager as well, where you talk about where the project is standing within each sprint or groups, and everyone will actually discuss what they have found so far. So with Agile, the priority is to satisfy the customer, very much like waterfall approach. And it's actually easier to implement changes because if there is something that needs to be changed in one sprint, that can be communicated in the other sprints and that can be implemented easily. Whereas in waterfall, you would have to go back to changing perhaps your planning stage based on what you have found with your procurement issue during the executing stage. And that's quite difficult to go back into changing one of the phases as well. So it's done well, or it's suited with IT projects where you're using software, but also with business projects where you work together on a daily basis where you discuss the progress of the project. You would argue that waterfall sometimes as well, people have those meetings where they debrief the senior manager. In Agile, it's really, really common, and it's something that it has to be implemented when you're doing the project as well. So it's also something where you have to build the project by motivating individual team member within those sprints. And the fact that you have review every day or every week about where the project's standing, that's actually a way to motivate your team to do something. Because I remember when I was involved in Agile with the daily Scrum, you had to do something for you to actually debrief your whole team every day about where you're standing. So that's actually a tool for motivation as well. And it's quite popular and it's quite used a lot in the industry now because it's most efficient in terms of saving time. If you have your large group divided into smaller group and everyone is doing the same thing, you don't have to wait until everybody is finished to have the final product. If one of the sprints or one of the small group will have a result, you just have to test that and see if it's working for everybody, and then that's it. So it does help save in terms of timing when you're doing a project. So if you had to look at both closely, you will see that waterfall, you have that stage of where you define the products, perhaps with between the initiating and planning stage together, and then you start to do the executing stage, the building stage, and then when you're doing the business stage, you actually carry on with your procurement and all the work. So you would do a bit of actual work happening, and then you will have the stage where if you have a product before the closing stage, there will be quality assurance, so you will review that. So that's actually part of the closing stage. and then you have the product is released. But for Agile, you have pretty much the same thing. If you look at it, you would think that Agile is a division or a small version of waterfall. So in every Agile sprint that you have a small group, they will do the same thing that you do in a waterfall approach. They will define the product or the project, and they will sort of work on the project and then release a sample, and that sample will be tested until it's the right solution. So it's as if you have smaller group doing exactly the same thing, and that's actually is there to minimize the risk and also to save time in terms of until instead of waiting from one phase to be done to move on to the next phase, they're all doing the same thing and then can actually use the release product. Any questions so far? Now, if you think about your case studies for 2A, 2B, and 3, would they have been suitable to use Agile, or would they have been something that you would have preferred to use for your particular case study? What do you think? Let's say for case study like Hume City Council or Heathrow, because they're quite construction related case study. Do you think that those type of case study or scenario will be well suited with Agile, or can it be done with Agile or only waterfall? Anyone? Okay, so I hope you guys are can hear me because my internet connection sometimes drops in and out. But if you can hear me, can you hear me? Just double checking. Okay. So you will actually see that for case study like the Lightning Lab or even Baldwin Water as well, you can use Agile for construction case studies because the project team tend to want to see one stage finished before you move on to the next one. You might think that perhaps waterfall was the best suited for those type of projects. Now, in terms of approach, we do have PMBOK that we use here. We follow PMBOK's approach with the knowledge area, but there are other approaches as well out there, such as Prince2. So with Prince2 here, you'll notice that it's a process-based sort of approach rather than a knowledge-based like PMBOK. Process-based because it's about what you should do to manage a project successfully. Whereas PMBOK that we've so far, if you remember, it was about what you should know to manage a project successfully. So you should know the scope, you should know the time, you should know the budget, you should know procurement, stakeholder, and so on. In Prince though, it's about the process. What sort of process would you follow for the project to be successful? PMBOK was developed by project managers in the US and it's now used pretty much all over the world, including Australia and New Zealand. Prince 2 was developed by project managers in the UK. There is a lot of similarity between the two, but one is process driven and the other one is knowledge driven. With Prince 2, you have 7 principles, 7 themes, and 7 processes that you need to follow in order to complete your project successfully. And the difference between the two are pretty much what I've already highlighted. One is process based, the other is knowledge based. And Prince 2 is prescriptive. So if you go to a doctor and they give you a prescription, that means that they actually want you to literally take those medication, drink it for you to feel better. Whereas in PMBOK with the knowledge is descriptive. So you need to understand those knowledge and you will apply it yourself. So it's as if you're reading a notice and then you have to put everything together, but the notice is what they're giving you. So with Prince2, it's something that you need to do. If you follow this step, then you will be able to manage your project successfully and run the project successfully. And PMBOK, if you know this step, now you're trying to apply it based on what you know, you might be able to manage the project successfully. So with Prince2, you have integrated set of principles, processes, and themes. So it goes with the principles, the processes, and the themes. You will notice that the themes and the principles are quite similar to PMBOK. So it's not so much about you don't know nothing and then you start doing the process and then you'll be successful. You have to know the principles behind running a project. You have to know the key themes for you to be able to do the processes involved in managing projects. For PMBOK, you have each knowledge area that you can actually look into isolation. So you can actually sit down, develop your scope management based on your WBS and think about the deliverables and milestone. And then you can actually look into your stakeholder management separately from scope management, just thinking about who can be or can affect the project. So each of those knowledge area can be seen separately, remembering that they're also integrated because lastly we talked about if one was not done properly, it might affect other knowledge areas as well. You still need to think about those integrations, but you can actually look at them in isolation as we've done in the course. With Prince2, all the project roles are clearly defined because before you start, everyone knows what their involvement is and they actually follow the process. You can't even follow the process if you don't know what your roles and responsibilities are. In PMBOK, it focuses mostly on the project manager's role. So you will see that all those knowledge area are actually for the project manager to know, and the project manager will actually dictate how the project will be run underneath it. And that project manager is the client representative one. So it's the one that has pretty much the responsibility to know all the knowledge area and to run the team based on the knowledge area as well. So Prince2 is actually the concept tailored approach. So something of we have come up with a process, there is a clear framework, and people have to follow them to be able to manage the project. And PMBOK is we have this knowledge area, you have to know them before you start managing your project. So it's less flexible. So now the 7 themes of Prince2 are actually quite similar to the 10 knowledge area of PMBOK. With Prince2, you need to sort of know the business case, which is actually related to the project goals and objective and requirements, such as those related to scope, so the work that is involved. You need to know the organization that would be involved in the project, which is actually quite linked to stakeholders, human resources as well, so even procurement as well, if you think about that. You need to know the quality. And quality as well is something that you need to know for projects, which we haven't covered in this course, but it's covered in one particular course. You need to plan, so you know the plans, so which is quite similar to PMBOK as well, because you have to know pretty much how to plan every single element. You also have to think about risk as a theme for Prince2, and there is risk as a knowledge for PMBOK. Change management in case there is change control, which is part of the risk as well for PMBOK. And you have to know the progress of your projects. That's one of the themes as well. So someone who has knowledge of PMBOK can easily sort of learn on how to use Prince2 as well, because you have the underlying knowledge area that are quite similar to the 7 themes discussed in Prince2. So with the 7 themes, if you remember, there are business case, organization, quality, plans, risk, change, and progress. And there is also what we call the 7 principles. So the 7 principles are the underlying justifications or principle on why we undertake projects. You have to sort of have the continued business justification. So there has to be every time that you're doing one step in the process of Prince2, you have to continue make sure that you are following the project goals and objectives. That it's getting you closer and closer to that. And also there is an element of learn from experience. If you remember for PMBOK, we talked about you can use analogous method where you think about previous project or similar type of project. So in Prince 2, the principle are learning from experience is also highlighted there. If you've done something that is similar before, trying to use the lesson learned there and apply it to the new project. You have to define the roles and responsibilities. Similarly to PMBOK, you have to define the roles and responsibility of your human resources as well as your stakeholders as well. Principle of Prince 2, one of them is to manage by stages. You will notice that in PMBOK with the milestone, you would have as well stages that you need to follow to complete the project. In Prince 2, you manage by exception. So this is actually for all the risks that might happen. You might find ways to change a few things. So it doesn't have to be strictly the previous stages that you have followed. And it's focused on the products, on the end products, which is quite related to quality as well. And it's tailored to suit the project environment. So with the 7 processes involved in Prince 2, you will have starting up a project. So the initial idea, which comes with initiating phase as well. So you're initiating a project, and then you have directing a project, controlling a stage, managing product delivery, managing a stage boundary, and closing a project. So the stages, they're called different processes, but if you look at the way that they're described, it's pretty much similar to the waterfall stages of initiating, planning, executing, and monitoring. So Prince 2, even though it was developed after PMBOK, it was perhaps based or inspired by PMBOK as well. It's a process-driven approach, but the processes are very similar to the processes that you would have in one of the PMBOK methodology, like waterfall, for example. Now, if you think about your case studies, do you think that they would have been much suited with a Prince 2 approach rather than a PMBOK? Thinking about the 7 themes, the 7 processes, and the 7 principles. What do you think? I personally think with the similarities that there is between PMBOK and Prince 2, you could have applied Prince 2 in some of your case studies and you would have found it quite easier to apply because of defining the themes or following the themes, following the processes, and following the principle would have been quite similar to what you've done for PMBOK. There's no very big difference between the two. Now, so if we had to move on into other types of methodology, whether you're applying PMBOK or Prince 2, you have what we call change management. So change management is actually closely related to risk. So something unforeseen, unpredicted happen, and you have to change a little bit like what we spoke last week about change control. But in this case here, your entire project is based on that change. So implementing that particular change. To be able to implement that particular change, you have to assess for the change, prepare for that change, plan for the change, implement the change, sustaining the change, and then you come out with a successful implementation of that change. So that's actually a type of methodology for a project that has been initiated because of some sort of risk or unpredicted event that happened. So an entire project, which is quite different to what you've done last week, because last week was just a risk that happened within a certain project that you're working on, and you're trying to implement a change for that. Here, it's a type of change or methodology where you're applying a whole approach to change management because the project is set up to be a change management project. So you do have process driven, which is pretty much associated to a Prince 2 approach. But in this one here, you do have a lot of other methodologies like Lean, Six Sigma. So with Lean and Six Sigma, it's all about cutting out waste and it's all about using statistics to minimize the defect. So usually there will be some sort of defect or some sort of issue with a certain process in an organization and you have to overcome that or you have to minimize that sort of issue. And there are a lot of trainings about Prince 2 slash process driven. approaches like Lean and Six Sigma. We have courses in RMIT that focus on those parts of those sort of methodologies. In this class, we haven't covered that. And the other methodology that is quite different as well, it's called post-disaster project management. So it's actually projects that are derived or initiated because of the disaster. So there is a disaster, and there is a project of basically returning the community safety or rebuilding a certain infrastructure that has been destroyed. So you will notice here it's quite different to the normal sort of project because of the context of which is happening. It's happening in the context where there is a disaster, a big accident, and the context here is also element of having community out of danger. So when you're doing your project, whether you're doing a project where you're rehabilitating community back to safety, or perhaps you're doing a project where you're establishing or rebuilding a building, you have to think about safety as well. So it's not only cost driven or time driven, but it's also about safety of the community there. So with post disaster, you might think that the processes will be the same in terms of using initiating, planning stage, executing, and closing stage. But somehow there is no initiating stage because the disaster happened suddenly. So you will notice that nobody had time to prepare for it. So it's that initiating stage where someone has an idea doesn't actually happen. It comes down to the planning stage straight away because there is something that has triggered that idea of rebuilding the building, which is a disaster, and you will start your project straight away with the planning stage. So there are a lot of approaches that I use here. One of them is the Bennett hierarchy. With the Bennett hierarchy, there is a problem or there is a disaster. And then you have to think about the resources. That's why usually you have NGOs that think about their donations or resources, whether it's from external donors or external community, or is it within that country? So you have to think about what sort of input resources that you have, and then what sort of output, what you need to produce, the reaction that you will have from the community and local and public or state government, as well as the reaction that you have with volunteers that are involved in those type of projects. And then you have an outcome, and how success should look like. One of the other approach that is used is the logical framework approach, where you're thinking about the community first, but in terms of what sort of activities will be put in place to come up with what will lead to community safety, what sort of assumption has to be made, and what sort of output has to be made. Here, you would notice that you're actually questioning the your assumption as you go. So you're thinking about what needs to be done in terms of community safety, and then you think about how things has to be done. So everything that you would be doing would actually comes down with some sort of assumption, and you actually question those assumptions as you go as well. I normally teach this course, post disaster project management. It's supposed to be an elective. I think it still is an elective as well, and it's quite different to the normal project management stages that we have followed, starting with not having an initiating stage, and also how things are done for small countries and big countries as well. Because small country will rely on external donors, a large country like Australia would have a body in place from the state level, state government level, that will help with resources in terms to overcome certain disaster. Any questions so far? So that's pretty much it in terms of some of the other types of methodologies that there are out there. There are more than that, but just cover a few of them. And we have specific courses at RMIT that cover each one of those methodology. This was an introductory courses just to give you an idea of how projects are viewed in terms of knowledge area from PMBOK, as well as the waterfall approach, one stage after the other. So in terms now of your assignment 3. What I'll do now is I'll show you some example of PowerPoint slides to give you a little bit of an overview or an idea of what you could or how you could present your PowerPoint. Remembering that you have to put the link of the video in the first slide. So this is an example of one student. You can see the link is actually provided there. So if you're using PowerPoint embedded, sometimes you will notice that your video will appear sort of way there. Just bear in mind that you have to submit the PowerPoint slides on Canvas because there's no link for videos. And you can provide a link there so I can see that video presentation. So some of the students started to acknowledge the urgent news and see how it has affected some areas of their project, starting, for example, the time. If that's actually is only affecting the time, perhaps it could affect the cost, it could affect some of the things as well. So they acknowledge that and showing that this is the urgent news that we got, and this is where it has affected our previous assumptions from 2A and 2B. And then you have a risk register. So with the risk register, to assess the potential risk mentioned in the urgent news, just bear in mind that you would have the risk ID, you have the risk description, the category, the likelihood, consequence, the degree of risk or the rating, the mitigation method in one column, the residual risk. So have a column of residual risk to explain what the residual risk would be before you assess the residual risk. So before you find out what's their likelihoods, their consequence, and the rating. And then you have a column with the responsibility of the person that will deal with that particular risk and the indicators. So the signs that will tell you that the main risk and the residual risk are about to happen. And all of these likelihood and consequences comes from the risk matrix, which is universal. So you would have that as well to follow through on how to assess the likelihood and consequences as well. Now, that's one part. You have to acknowledge the risk, assess the risk, and think about the solution. So that change that has to be implemented. So in this particular case here, that student talks about the change in terms of perhaps how the stakeholder or the community talks about the time and talks about other changes as well. Use a change request log to show how the change will be implemented and perhaps talk about how the change will be impacted and mention as well. When I say the change will be impacted, I mean the change will impact the current stages of your project. So just remember, this is all in the planning stage. And while you're doing the planning stage, you receive those urgent news of these are the changes that might happen. So you have to implement that. So you still have time to change all the assumptions that you made early and show how you will manage or provide a solution to those changes as well. So that particular student look into how that particular change affected procurement and costs and show how it impacted as well as the time as well in the next slide and talk about the potential solution. That was it for that particular example. So if I go to the second one, any questions so far? With the second example, that student had a cover page, obviously, and then the link to the video can be provided in the first slide. And one slide where they acknowledge the urgent news, so highlighted the urgent news. So you need to have a sort of slide where you acknowledge that the urgent news or you explain the urgent news, how you understood it. And there is a side or a slide of risk management that the student highlighted and provided a risk register based on the risk matrix with the residual risk included. And that student went on, separated the risk matrix into, so the first stage of identifying and assessing, and then the first stage or the other stage of the response, which that particular student allocated or associated to the solution as well. Which is one way you can do that, because your mitigation measure in your risk are actually the solutions, because you putting the mitigation measures are column to show how you minimize or deal with that risk. You could actually link it to your solution as well. So that student did that, had the mitigation measure and showed how, sorry, it's here, how there would be potential solution and how they can be implemented within the other assumptions, perhaps with cost, how that would change cost. Okay, what do you mean that you can find communication documents? Okay, I don't understand the question. If you're talking about the communication, it's also it's with what you've done with assignment 2A or 2B. So there is no documents provided for assignment 3. Everything that you would be implementing is linked to your previous assignments. If you haven't done that part of your assignment, you have to talk to your colleague and ask for the person who's done it to provide you with that part of your assignment. But I'm assuming that everyone will have access to the previous assignment 2A and 2B to make the changes according to the urgent news. So with those changes on how to implement, this particular student actually linked the two, from the risk mitigation measure to the solution, and show how the solution will be implemented as well. But that student forgot to give the change request log to show the process of actually implementing the change before you get to the solution, and that's what is missing here. And that's pretty much it for that. So the first one was a good example. The second one, sort of not so much of a good example because it's missing element here. Okay, any questions so far? Because that's pretty much it for our session. We This is our last session of the semester. I hope you learned something in terms of how, in general, projects are managed following a waterfall approach, and also how you can actually implement the knowledge area from PMBOK into managing your project. So assignment 3 is individual, it's not a group assignment, and it's related to you providing a PowerPoint slide where you will insert a link of your video. Okay, so in previous semester, some of the case studies like the Volkswagen Mexico wasn't used, so I don't have example of Volkswagen Mexico. But the structure is the same. I'm actually showing you this example as the structure, not as something that you have to copy the solution. So if you look at the structure of the PowerPoint slides, that's how it should look like. But in terms of your risk identification, risk register, you have to come up with those based on the urgent news. Any other questions? Yes,
Yeah, Erica, the question part B requires resources. There was nothing mentioned in the examples about resources. What can you, how we can link it with the resources? Are you able to?
okay, so the example provided here, those are the students that are provided based on their understanding. And if we go to assignment, if you have it in front of you, assignment 3, it's showing that you have to talk about how your particular unexpected urgent news would affect the resources in terms of human resources as well as the physical resources. So if we go back there, let me just go back. Okay, let me share this with you. I've got a lot of things open. Okay, so part B, you will respond to your client, who is also your senior manager. Assure your client that you can still achieve the project goals within time. It's called budget and resources. So yes, this is actually you looking at what you have already provided in assignment 2A and 2B, and make sure that you will still manage to achieve the project after you've heard about the urgent news within time, scope, budget, and resources. These are from assignments to be human resources and physical resources that you found. Would you be still capable of providing or achieving the project goal within the resources that you have mentioned there? That's what it means.
I didn't see resources mentioned in any of the examples.
Perhaps they didn't have the same description of assignment because the assignments have changed slightly. It's not exactly the same assignment. So every semester we tend to change the requirements a little bit, otherwise student will copy from previous student. In this case here, you do have resources. In the previous example, they didn't have resources.
Okay. Thanks, Erica.
Not a problem. Any other questions? Yes, Brendan?
Hi, Erica. I'm doing the Mexico one. So
Yeah.
it's about the team at VW Mexico. The plant has 21 months and a budget of 3.3 to design, install the assembly line, and bring mass production of parts. Right. So keyword is once it goes into production, I'm assuming it gets handed over to the production people. But then in the urgent news, it's talking about issues with ongoing production. For me, I'm contextualizing this in a business sense, and I would be thinking, well, that's out of my scope because I've delivered the production line. If you've got a problem now with the production line as a business as usual going concern, that's not part of my original scope, so that's potentially scope creep for me. Or am I thinking too literal about this?
No, that's actually a very good question. And that's actually very good because, yes, the way your case study was set up, it was set up as you have to produce this. But then your urgent news is actually showing that it's beyond what you have to produce. Not only do you have to produce, but you have to check that what you have produced leave your work and go somewhere else or be supplied in those ports. So one of the things that you can or I can tell you to do instead of giving an answer to this is beyond my scope creep project scope, it might lead to scope creep because we didn't agree with that in the beginning. You can actually show them two options saying that yeah, this is beyond my scope, what we agreed earlier. However, if we were to go this, you would have to increase the budget, you would have to increase the time because now it's not just me producing, but it's also me delivering that to the ports. And then that will mean that you have to extend the project, extend the scope, extend the money, and extend the time as well. And if you had to extend the time, you would need additional time, we need additional costs, and we need eventually to cover that scope as well.
Okay, yeah, because that's just how I thought about it. Because I was worried that at the end of it, it says, if you don't answer in 7 days, I'll contact Consumer and Business Services and lodge a complaint. And I'm thinking, well, hang on, I've delivered what I said I was going to deliver. This is like additional to help out. So that's good clarity,
Yeah.
Erica. There.
It's good to actually highlight that because the problem is some of the clients would have to want you to extend what you agreed on. So first of all, you can actually start with saying that this is beyond the scope that you initially agreed on. And second, if you were to do that, this would have to be changed to additional budget, additional time, and additional scope. And that would extend your input for that particular project.
Without giving too much away, I know that we're recording. There's other people doing Mexico, but sort of one sort of area that I thought to sort of hypothesize on was, hey, look, we've delivered the project under cost, and we've got this contingency which we're going to hand back to you guys that you could utilize to fulfill whatever costing that we come up with. I'm trying not to give the answer as to how I'm looking at it, Erica, but that's sort of where I was sort of coming in. So good news story and say, hey, look, yeah, great, you got a problem. As you know, we under-delivered by X $1,000. There's a pool of money there that we could start using. So from a resource standpoint, we're not having to borrow more or whatever the financial situation is. And then from that, you could leverage on and say, hey, look, we can fit this much in here, and then we would need to have additional funds, as an example.
Yeah, as long as you bring to their attention, for example, that you're not categorically saying no to the change, but you are also open in terms of, yeah, I can manage to do that, but we'll have to be perhaps adding more funding or more time to that. So it's a negotiation that you would actually go ahead with.
Because the other one last point before I take up everyone else's time, but I did do research in that, and the Jetta or the Volkswagen Jetta that's actually the components are going on is actually made in Mexico. So it makes sense that the componentry that we've done here for the axle and for the motor is actually remaining in Mexico to go on the assembly line for the full car anyway. So it sort of links together.
Exactly. Yes. Good, good research. Okay, so I think, Brendan, any more questions from you?
No, I think that's it. I don't know. I think Uma or Nat Hadarad might have had some questions about VW as well.
Okay. I'm going to read through certain question. First of all, I think Atherat was asking, would you mind explaining residual risk again? And it's the same calculation as the other. So residual risk are the risk that will come from the main risk. So if you have, for example, heavy storm, the consequence of heavy storm would be another risk, which might be flooding or flash floods. So residual risk is flash floods. The main risk is heavy storm. And it's the same assessment that you would do in terms of likelihood, consequence, and weighting based on this risk assessment matrix that you would do for the residual risk as well. So you have to include a column where you explain the residual risk and another column where you are assessing the residual risk. Okay, so now in terms of our consultant question, would our contribution be valued and graded if it was heading toward opening up more questions that need to be answered by internal and external entities to 2B? Saying that because not all variables and data are available. Yes, so this is your first, you haven't actually completed the project at that stage. It's not finished. And obviously there is always a time during the project where client comes back to you with more questions or additional changes. This is one of them, or more worries. So you can actually answer it with a final sort of idea, because I think some of your cases they're actually giving you the solution, like option A, option B. That's final because you actually can explain how you would implement option A and option B. But in your case, let's say if you're doing Volkswagen, there is no option A and option B. So you can actually get back with proposition saying perhaps this is outside of my scope, this is outside of my budget, this is outside this is one we didn't agree with. However, if we were to do that, we might look into adding more budget, like such as we might do this, we might do that. So you coming up with your proposition. Yes, it's more questions, but it's not a definite no. Because what clients don't really like is no, we're not gonna do that. They like propositions and ideas when they're actually giving you something. It's sort of as if you were negotiating with them, but you're giving them a different alternative and proposition. Any other questions so far? Yes, Atheat?
Yeah, I'm just want to ask about the change request log. So do we put the information from the urgent news as like this is need to be changed in the change request log here?
Yes, everything is based on the urgent news. But
Okay.
the urgent news starts with your risk register because you
Yep.
bounce down your risk register.
Yep.
And also the change log will be inspired by the urgent news initially, but also the mitigation measure that you like. If when you're providing for each risk, you have potential solution on how to deal with those risks, and that would guides the change that need to be made as well. So you can actually be inspired by that as well to have it in your change log.
Okay, thank you.
Not a problem. Any other questions? I think Umar, you had a question, isn't it? I think you contacted me and saying that you had some questions. I'm not sure.
Yes, Erica. Brendan has already asked that, so I'm all right. Thank you.
Not a problem. Anyone else? Okay, so that's pretty much it for our semester. So it's our last course. I hope you enjoyed the semester, you learned something, and you should be able to receive your mark for assignment 2B during this week. If you have any more questions in terms of your assignment 3, just let me know. So it's individual, but if you want to consult your team to brainstorm idea, you can do it. But your video presentation is individual, and your assignment 3 is individual as well. Other than that, if you don't have any more questions, yes, Brendan.
Yeah, good point there, Erica, because we had some discussion with some of our team members, and they thought because it's individual that they shouldn't be talking amongst each other. But given that we did A2 and A2A and 2B together, and 3 is a formulation of that, I don't think you can get past not talking as a group. Obviously, it's individual assignment, but you got to talk to one another.
Yes, you can talk to one another. If I'm aware that some of the component in your assignment has been done by one particular person who could be different to you. So if you don't understand that, perhaps you don't understand how the budget was derived or the time, you could talk to your team member that has done that and could explain to you what they think about the change in terms of the time or the cost. So that can be discussed as a team. But the submission is individual, the PowerPoint is individual, the video recording is individual.
Okay, thank you, Erica.
Not a problem. Any other questions? Okay, so that's pretty much it for today and for our semester. It was a pleasure having you in this class, and I wish you all the best with your other study or courses as well. And hopefully we'll come across you soon.
Sorry, Erica. How does it work? Do we get a final score for a grade for the subject at the end? How does it work? Sorry, I'm new to this.
University. Yes, you will. Obviously, I will mark assignment 3. I will enter the results in the system, and RMIT will release the grades. So that will be done with the admin, not with me. So after I mark assignment 3, I'll provide the grades, and then it will be released by the university. That's pretty much it. Now the time frame, I'm not sure. It depend because they don't release one course; they release all the courses all together. So it will depend on other courses as well. If the other lecturers have finished their marking and are ready to be released, that's how you'll get your results. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Erica.
Okay, not a problem. Okay, so that's it for today. Enjoy the rest of your day and perhaps your semester. If you're taking other courses, we might see each other again. If you don't, you're only taking this course, this is probably the end. So I wish you all best of luck for assignment 3 and pretty much for your future career path as well. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.